snap. The kick is in the air, and the kick this time is no, sir-ree. No, sir-ree. Final score, Tennessee 20, Florida 17. Pandemonium reigns.
You're listening to the RTI Podcast, powered by WalkingTopInsider.com.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the RTI Podcast. I am Nathaniel Rutherford, the managing editor of RockyTopInsider.com, joined by Ben McKee, our staff writer at RTI. He's also the co-host and producer of the Swain Event morning radio show. Welcome you all in to another episode, and we appreciate you tuning in. If it's your first time listening, we appreciate it a whole lot. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and if you're wanting to find out how you can listen to more, we are on iTunes. We have, if you have an Apple phone, where you can get to us that way, or I guess Apple Podcasts now, it's not iTunes anymore. I have no idea. I don't have an iPhone, so I'm not sure when they're changing all that over, but either way, we're on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, whatever it is. You can also get us on Android for whatever podcaster app you use on your Android device. You can find us on there. You can go to our website, RockyTopInsider.com, and click on the podcast tab, listen to it that way, or download it straight from there as well. And you can also interact with the podcast on YouTube. That's a way I've seen a lot of you really start listening and interacting with us is that way. We've gotten, I think, increased viewership just about every single week now of our RTI podcast on YouTube. So I appreciate you all doing that. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Just Rocky Top Insider on YouTube, and we get comments from you guys all the time, and I may not always respond to them on YouTube, or I don't usually respond to a whole lot of them, but I see them, and eventually I'll address more of them here on the actual podcast, and we may have kind of a viewer comment episode at some point too. Maybe this later on this week, because I don't imagine you all want to hear too much of a breakdown of Georgia. This game is not going to be a fun one. But Ben, speaking of the Georgia game, actually, before we get into kind of the main topic of the podcast, Jeremy Pruitt was asked on Monday. We're recording this on Monday afternoon, so just a few hours ago for us. He was asked on Monday about the idea that Georgia fans are going to try to do their own checkered Neyland. There's been a movement called #RedOutNeyland on Twitter for several weeks. I noticed it weeks ago. The Georgia fans kind of started it and have been looking to try to flood Neyland Stadium with a bunch of red and black, I'm sure too, because that's their secondary color. But now there's a movement that took up, started to get a little more push last week because of a Reddit post where Georgia fans are trying to do their own version of checkered Neyland. It says on the Reddit post, Dog Nation, checkered Neyland, check below for your seats. And it has the map out there of, with the checkered Neyland map that Tennessee published back in 2017 for the Georgia game. It says orange sections wear red, white sections wear black, and there's, ticket prices are still kind of high for the game from what I expect the game to be like, but they have gone down. I've seen several Georgia fans posting about, finding kind of cheapish tickets for the game, and some people still finding tickets for like $60, which is really cheap considering what SEC games go for nowadays. But Pruitt was asked about Georgia and them trying to checker Neyland Stadium. He was asked a two-part question. The first one had to do with Tennessee's wide receiver room. The second one was about Georgia fans. And his reply was, quote, "I have a hard time believing that the other question you asked is going to happen," talking about the Georgia fans wanting to checker Neyland. Ben, do you think we see how many Georgia fans, I guess, for us to say, do you think we see a Neyland Stadium on Saturday? Because I actually agree with Pruitt in this one. I don't think you'll be able to see them do a nice concerted effort of getting a checker Neyland of Georgia fans, but I do think you're going to see quite a few Bulldog fans. I don't know if it'll be to the degree that we've seen Alabama fans kind of take over Neyland Stadium before, because it's, Bama fans, I remember when I was in college, especially in, I can't remember what year it was. I guess it would have been an even year, so I guess maybe 2012 is when, it's either 2010 or 2012 when I was in, it would have been 2012 because I wasn't in college in 2010, but it's 12 or 14 when I remember Alabama fans, there were a lot of them there, and it would get pretty loud actually when Bama would score touchdowns, and I know that's, to me, the only time I can think of really Neyland Stadium kind of being invaded by opposing fans was then with Alabama. And I think LSU fans, not the last time they played them, but back in 2011, they came pretty strong because LSU fans travel pretty well. But I don't think we'll see a checkered Neyland. I do think you will see a lot of Georgia fans. I do think Vol fans have enough pride to maybe now that all this stuff's happening, if they're considering selling, their tickets to Georgia fans, I think some people will hold off on doing that now. Maybe some other Tennessee fans. I do still think we see several thousand Georgia fans at the game on Saturday, but I gotta agree with Pruitt on this one. I would be pretty surprised if a full-blown red and black checkered Neyland especially in the Georgia sections or even a little bit beyond that, actually did happen.
No, I would be too. But the one thing I do disagree with you is I do think that there will be as many Georgia fans as there typically is Alabama fans when Alabama fans take over Neyland, kind of when the Vols are down. And I point to last year's game against Alabama at home. There was a ton of Alabama fans, and even though there were a ton of Alabama fans, there were slightly more Tennessee fans. So, yes, Tennessee fans are obviously down on Tennessee football right now, but the season ticket holders will still show up. There will still be Tennessee fans that show up who aren't season ticket holders. So will there be a lot of Georgia fans? Yes, I think it'll be one of the highest number of opposing fans that we've seen in Neyland Stadium history. Like I do think that there will be a lot of Georgia fans, but even though there will be a lot of Georgia fans, I still think that there will be slightly more Tennessee fans, and obviously if there are slightly more Tennessee fans, then Georgia fans will be incapable of checkering Neyland red and black. So just kind of some basic math there is all I can think of as my reasoning. I know Tennessee fans are down right now, but there's not going to be a situation where just zero Tennessee fans show up. Right. And to me, not even just zero Tennessee fans, but even if Tennessee fans showed up like Vanderbilt football fans do, and what I mean by that is that every single home game, if there's 30,000 people in Vanderbilt Stadium, 10,000 of them are Vanderbilt fans. Even if it was that big of a difference between Georgia and Tennessee fans, that would be the only way that I would see Georgia being able to checker Neyland. And it just is not going to happen, simply because there will be slightly more Tennessee fans than Georgia fans. We saw it last year with Alabama. Alabama was obviously going to steamroll Tennessee, and there were still more Tennessee fans there despite there being a lot of Alabama fans. And even in 2017, when Tennessee was blown out by Georgia 41-0, the last time Georgia was in town, there were a lot of Georgia fans, and there will be more this year. But there's still enough Tennessee fans to kind of, offset the difference. So now I could see a situation on Saturday in I guess it is the upper southeast part of the stadium, in the upper deck on the opposite side of the press box, where all of the opposing fans sit above the band and above the student section. Usually when it's Florida or Georgia or Alabama in town, it's either painted blue for Florida or red or whatever color Alabama describes itself as. That corner up there is usually painted. So if that is all Georgia fans, now I can see those particular two sections, one being red, one being black, but the entire stadium, no. Simply put, there's still going to be more Tennessee fans there, although Georgia will have an impressive showing from its fans.
Yeah, and there's, I don't blame Georgia fans for doing it. If the roles were reversed and Tennessee was the number 3 team in the country and playing the way Georgia's been playing, you and Swain were talking this morning about which team has looked best of the top 3 teams, Georgia, Clemson, and Bama. And you could absolutely argue that Georgia's actually looked better to start this season so far than what Bama and Clemson have, just from quality opponents they played and how they've been just destroying teams. And they played a top 10 Notre Dame team and won that one. But if the roles were reversed and Tennessee was number 3, Georgia was 1-3, and they had just an abysmal start to their season, losing games that they had no business losing, and then coming off a bad loss to a rival in the SEC East, I would 100% understand Vol fans wanting to go down to Athens and checker. I just forgot their stadium's name down there, but to go checker Jordan Hare. Is that it? No, is that whatever it is down in Georgia. I don't care. It's the Bulldogs.
Georgia's Sanford Stadium.
Sanford, thank you. Jordan Hare is Auburn, right?
Auburn. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Anyway, Sanford Stadium. That's right. I don't know why I couldn't remember that one, but I wouldn't fault Vol fans at all for wanting to go down and checker Georgia Stadium and try to embarrass them, because Bulldog fans are very confident that their football team is going to be able to embarrass Tennessee's football team. So why not add some more insult to injury and on national television, on ESPN, and make Tennessee fans look bad? But I'm with you though. I mean, to me, there will still absolutely be more Tennessee fans than Georgia fans. That's never happened in Neyland Stadium. There's never been a case where it was even close to 50-50. It's never even been that close to 60-40 at Neyland Stadium, even with Alabama being number one and Tennessee not being very good in certain years like that. I don't know if it's been even close to 70-30. It's always been more Tennessee fans than the opposing fan base. But and to me this year, the fan turnout's been, there's been a lot of bad surprises for this season, but to me the fan turnout's been one of the biggest kind of positive surprises of the season, because you had a ho-hum 85,000 reported, which that was not what really showed up, but 85,000 reported for the first game of the season. And Ben, you and I talked about in the podcast. In fact, it was one of our buy or sell questions for the BYU game of how many people were actually going to show up for the game. We think it was going to be over 85,000, over 90,000. They ended up getting 92, and that didn't look like an actual inflating the numbers a whole lot. It did seem like 92 plus thousand were there in Neyland Stadium for that game. And then against UTC, Tennessee reported a slightly higher attendance total for that game than the season opener against Georgia State. It was 86 plus thousand for the UTC game, and it looked like it. I think you could tell the numbers were inflated a little bit, but it didn't look nearly as bad, nearly as empty as you were afraid it could have been, or we were afraid. Vol fans in general were afraid that it could have been after the way the season started. So I'm with you. I don't think we'll see a checker Neyland by Georgia, but I do think you will see and hear, because they like to bark, a lot of Bulldog fans in Knoxville on Saturday. But then we'll talk a little bit more about Georgia as the week goes on, and it's a very daunting game. There's a reason they're 25-point favorites heading into Neyland Stadium, and that could just grow as the week goes on. It opened up as a 22-point favorite. Now the 25-point favorites. It would not surprise me if it got up to 27-28 by the time kickoff happens. But looking at the rest of Tennessee's schedule, Ben, I don't think the SEC has kind of gone the way you and I both thought it was going to at the season's beginning. There were teams we thought would take step backs, like South Carolina, and we thought Kentucky would take a step back, maybe not to the extent that a lot of people thought they would. But now, thanks to injuries to both those teams, starting quarterbacks especially, but also injuries to Mississippi State's starting quarterback, Missouri, I think, has actually looked okay. They may not as good as people thought they were going to be, but they've still looked fine. Vanderbilt's been even worse than I thought they were going to be. UAB's been better than I thought they would, but that game is still one that Tennessee should be able to win, and as long as they don't come out with the same effort they gave against Georgia State, that they should win that one. My point in saying all this is Tennessee's schedule outside of Georgia and Alabama, it's actually a very, very winnable schedule in the terms, or in the regards that, if Tennessee could get decent quarterback play, they don't have to even have good to great quarterback play. If they can just get average, not turning the ball over 2 or 3 times a game from their quarterback, and the remaining games aside from Georgia and Alabama, the idea of Tennessee making a bowl game maybe isn't as far-fetched as you'd think with the 1-3 start. But let's look at the schedule as a whole, Ben. I was talking with you before we recorded the podcast and kind of talking about what we want to talk about for the show, and I wanted to kind of rank Tennessee's schedule from teams that are the most beatable to teams that Tennessee's going to have the toughest time beating. And I think obviously we're both going to put Alabama and Georgia kind of 1A, 1B. I mean, that's those 2 games. It'll take a monumental effort for Tennessee to pull upsets in those, and I don't think either one of us, I don't think most of all fans, and 98% of all fans, see Tennessee pulling off either one of those upsets. So we can kind of put those 2 aside, look at the rest of Tennessee's schedule. You have Mississippi State at home after Tennessee takes on Georgia this weekend, and that game's actually going to be a noon kickoff, so you're going to have an early kickoff, which I don't like if I'm Tennessee. I don't like if I'm a Vol fan. That's a noon kickoff. Then you have at Alabama, so we'll toss that out. So you have at home against Mississippi State, at home against South Carolina, at home against UAB, on the road against Kentucky. Then you have your bye week at Missouri, and then finish the season off at home against Vanderbilt. Ben, looking at the schedule, taking out Georgia and Alabama, which game, and we'll kind of rank it here in a second, but I want to get your kind of bookends here first. Which game to you, I guess aside maybe from UAB, which SEC game to you is the most winnable for Tennessee? I think here's an obvious answer, but which one to you is also the least winnable for Tennessee aside from Georgia and Alabama? For me, it's I think it's an obvious one. Vanderbilt's probably the most winnable SEC game remaining for me on the schedule. But then I look at the least winnable one for Tennessee. I don't like the Mississippi State matchup. I know they're not nearly as good as people thought they're going to be. That almost would be my answer because they're also coming off a bye week, and I think that's just it's giving them more time to prepare. But I'm going to go Missouri because it's on the road. Missouri just has Tennessee's number. I think that's a game where Missouri is going to be, they're getting kind of better as the season goes along. I think that's a game where as long as they haven't had a significant injury on either side of the ball, that game to me I think is the least winnable outside of Alabama and Georgia. So what are your two? If you want to throw in one, if you think it's Vanderbilt's the obvious answer, give me your next one after Vandy, and then what's your least winnable game besides Georgia and Alabama?
Yeah, my most winnable game is Vanderbilt, just because their defense is horrible. I mean, absolutely horrible. Their pass defense is bad. Their run defense is not good, and until their third game of the season, they were the only team left in the country who had not recorded a sack through however many weeks that was. I think it was through 3 weeks because they had a bye week 3. So they're not good on defense, which is very surprising considering Derek Mason is a defensive guy. And then you look on the offensive side of the ball, and Keyshawn Vaughn kind of does his thing, and Kalijah Lipscomb does his thing at receiver. And outside of that, nobody else is really producing. They have a all-SEC level tight end in Jared Pinkney, but he's not doing much just because they've received poor quarterback play from Riley Neal. The offensive line has been banged up and has not been good. So it's kind of like the Tennessee situation, where Tennessee has good receivers, a potential pro at tight end, a good stable of backs, but poor quarterback play and subpar offensive line play has kind of doomed Tennessee. And not necessarily the offensive line play. It has gotten better game by game. But against Georgia State, the offensive line was not good. And then you look at Vanderbilt, and yes, their schedule has been ridiculous. They opened with Georgia, then they played Purdue, then they played LSU. So they started 0-3, and 2 of those 3 teams were LSU and Georgia, who are arguably the 2 best teams in the SEC, and is going to give Alabama a run for its money. So even despite the rough start on the schedule, the offense has not looked good. So I think that is the most winnable SEC game remaining on Tennessee's schedule, just because Tennessee does have more talent. Tennessee has had more talent the last couple of years, but poor coaching, poor chemistry, and poor culture has prevented them from winning that game. So, and it's at home. That is a game I look at. It's the last game of the year. Tennessee should be a completely different football team by that point in the year, to where right now it's a youth movement for Tennessee. By that point in the year, they'll really no longer be freshmen because of how much they have played this year. And then the least likely game, I agree with you. I think it's Missouri. Missouri just has better talent. They're better coached. They have better players. They have a better quarterback. They're pretty physical up front along the offensive line and along the defensive line. Defensively, Cale Garrett really gets them into good situations. He's the heart and soul of that defense. Albert O, their tight end, a potential first-round pick, is a nightmare matchup for Tennessee. I don't know who Tennessee tries to stick on him. And you mentioned it, it's a road game. And Tennessee doesn't necessarily do good against the run, and Missouri runs the ball pretty well with Larry Roundtree and Kelly Bryant. So between Kelly Bryant, Larry Roundtree, and Albert O, I think that is a nightmare matchup for Tennessee. So I think Missouri is the least winnable SEC game outside of Alabama and Georgia, obviously. So I agree with you on those answers.
What do you make of the Mississippi State game? Because I look at that as, they have not been nearly as good as I thought they'd be. I didn't expect them to be, some kind of powerhouse or really challenging, Alabama per se for the SEC West or anything like that. But I thought they would be a little better than what they've been. And partially also that's been because Tommy Stevens has been suffering through injuries. And I think he missed last week's game, and then if I remember correctly, he played a little bit this past weekend, and they got hurt again, and they had to go back to their backup quarterback, who's more of a runner than he is a passer. But they have, to me, Tennessee has struggled. Well, they struggled in defense for the most part, just at point, just all across the board this year so far. They have gotten better at stopping the run, but they're going to be playing a team this weekend that Tennessee's going to, it'll be a miracle if they hold Georgia to under 200 rushing yards, maybe 250 in this game, because DeAndre Swift is just going to he is a back that, arguably the best one in the SEC. But then you also, the other person you make an argument for being the best in the SEC is who they'll be playing next week in Kylan Hill, and he's been phenomenal. Already has just under, I think he's 4 yards shy of 600 rushing yards on the season. He's been really good. The only team that shut him down this season so far has been Auburn, and that Auburn defense is really good, arguably the best defense in the SEC. I don't know if you can say arguably. I think they are the best defense in the SEC. I don't know that you could point to a defense that's better than theirs this year, at least in the SEC. But to me, Ben, that Mississippi State game, I said before the season I thought Tennessee was going to lose that game, and I think before the season you said Tennessee would win. I think you and I had it flip-flops where I picked Tennessee to lose the state, and you picked Tennessee to lose to South Carolina, and the other person picked the opposite. How do you feel about that Mississippi State game now? They got just absolutely shelled by Auburn. I know Auburn's obviously very good. They are a legitimate top 10 team right now. But they looked, they took care of business against Southern Miss. I guess at the start of the season they actually but they had a kind of a closer contest against Louisiana than you might expect them to have. And they won by 10. They won by 23 against Southern Miss. And they come out and at home lose to Kansas State. And Kansas State hasn't been super good. If I'm trying to pull up their record here, I don't think they're 3-1. So I guess they're okay. Their last loss came to Oklahoma State just now, but they haven't really played anybody else besides State and Oklahoma State. But they lost to Kansas State, came out and beat Kentucky by 2 touchdowns, and then just got absolutely blown out by Auburn. What do you think of Mississippi State? Because that game to me, I don't want to say it's I think most games on Tennessee's schedule now are a must win, but I don't want to say that it's like a win or suddenly you're the season is gone and the season is tanked. But that's a game to me that it's a pivotal matchup, because if you do win that one, I mean, you're staving off an absolute desperation mode by the time you're facing South Carolina at the end of October. But if you lose that one, you're going to be 1-6 facing South Carolina, and a very a decent chance of being 1-7 by the time you play UAB. I think that game's winnable. I don't like Tennessee having to try to face off against Kylan Hill, and Mississippi State also has some pretty decent receivers, especially with Cyrus Mitchell. I don't know that that's going to be. People are going to look at the kind of the record that Mississippi State has and the way they lost Auburn and say, oh, that's going to be a game that Tennessee has a very good shot of winning. I think Tennessee definitely has a shot. I don't know that I would say very good.
For the Mississippi State game, I really like Tennessee's chances. Mississippi State's defense did not, or let me retract that. Last year, Mississippi State's defense was one of the best in the country, if not the best in the SEC. What Bob Shute was able to do with the 3 first-round draft picks that moved on to the NFL was tremendous, and that's why he was one of the 3 finalists for the Broyles Award for the nation's top assistant. He was tremendous last year. Mississippi State's defense in general was tremendous, and it's honestly a shame that they didn't win more than they did, because they had so much talent on both sides of the ball. And while that defense was great last year, it is struggling mightily this year. And the Auburn game is kind of a cursor for what has been going on with them. And I get that Gus Malzahn is an offensive genius, but that Auburn offense isn't the offense that he has had in years past. The reason Auburn has been so successful this year is because of their defense and the fact that, led by Derek Brown, their defensive line is the best in the entire country. And on offense, they are making enough plays to win the football game. They're not out here Alabama style, just throwing the pigskin around and running over folks on their way to winning football games. They have a freshman quarterback in Bo Nix, who had not really thrown for over 200 yards until the Mississippi State game, and then he goes for over 300 yards. On the ground, Auburn was running the ball fairly successful. They had actually kind of struggled to run the ball the first couple of weeks, and then they exploded for over 300 rushing yards, I believe, this weekend, put up 59 points. Mississippi State's defense has looked bad all season. So if the Jarrett Guarantano, and yes, I believe JG will be the starting quarterback at that point, just because I don't think this coaching staff wants to throw Maurer into the fire against Georgia, against Alabama. So I am going forward with the assumption that JG will be at least the starting quarterback. That's not to say that Maurer won't play in the game, But if JG does start, and the JG that shows up that played against Auburn last year, that played against South Carolina, that played against Kentucky, I 100% Tennessee wins this football game. I absolutely do, because Mississippi State's defense has not been all of that. And then you look at the offensive side of the ball, and they really missed Tommy Stevens. Garrett Schrader looked good a week ago against Kentucky, but the true freshman kind of came back to reality this past weekend. And he's a little banged up right now, but Mississippi State's offense is better with Tommy Stevens at the helm, and he's kind of been banged up as well. So injuries have kind of forced Joe Moorhead's hand on the offensive side of the ball. And now Mississippi State does have weapons on offense that scare me. Kylan Hill, their starting running back, is dynamic. If he did not play at Mississippi State, he would be talked about in the same conversation as DeAndre Swift and Najee Harris and Keyshawn Vaughn. He is that productive, but because he plays at Mississippi State, he's not. So I feel really good about Tennessee's chances in that game if it gets good quarterback play, because of how poorly Mississippi State's defense has played. But they do present problems that scare me if Tennessee continues to receive the quarterback play that they have been receiving. Regardless, I think it's a four-quarter game. And, I've been saying all along that Brent Samaglia is going to win Tennessee a football game this season. That could be the game. So I think Mississippi State is a little more disappointing as we have played the first month of the season than what I expected kind of looking at them preseason. And if Tennessee can elevate its quarterback play, I think it's a game that Tennessee has a good chance of winning.
It's one that I definitely think Tennessee has a decent chance of winning. I just, I don't know. I'm not maybe as confident as you are in it, and I would put it closer. I think I would still put it closer to Missouri than I would Vanderbilt if I'm going to, putting it in that range of where we both kind of think Vanderbilt's the most winnable game left, and Missouri is the least winnable besides Georgia and Alabama. I think I would still put it closer to Missouri than I would Vanderbilt at this point. And all this can change. We've already seen several different quarterbacks go down with a season for injury, and you just mentioned it there, Ben. I mean, there's no guarantee that Garantano is going to be Tennessee's starting quarterback by the time, let alone when they play Mississippi State, but by the time they play, South Carolina or Kentucky even. So a lot of this is subject to change, and a lot of this will change as the season goes on. In fact, look back at our season predictions at the beginning of the season. Obviously, our discussions for these games have changed significantly. That's not just because of Tennessee. That's also, like I said, because of other injuries. Looking at both the other two SEC games we haven't discussed, Ben, South Carolina and Kentucky, both of those to me are very interesting and for two or three different reasons. But for me, the South Carolina game, I've thought since the beginning of the season Tennessee could win that game. I think right now, I think it's a very, very winnable game for Tennessee, even though it's going to suck for Tennessee. They're coming off playing Alabama, but South Carolina's going to be coming off playing in back-to-back weeks Georgia and Florida. They have a bye week this week to rest up after their 24-7 win over Kentucky. But like I said, they play Georgia, then they play Florida, then they play Tennessee on the road. They go on the road to Georgia, at home against Florida, on the road to Tennessee. Tennessee will be playing, obviously, Georgia this weekend, Mississippi State, and then Bama, and then South Carolina. Neither one of those teams is going to be really probably in great mental shape and great physical shape after the beatings they're going to take, because I'd have a hard time believing that either one of these two teams will be coming off a victory when they play each other. But you're looking at a situation, Ben, where both these teams could be looking at a potential disaster scenario where South Carolina has 2 wins, Tennessee has 1, maybe they have 2. But both of them are looking at the loser of this game potentially, being eliminated from bowl contention, because if things play out the way you expect them to, South Carolina will be 2-5 taking on Tennessee. Tennessee could be 1-6 taking on the Gamecocks. They could also be 2-5. But either way, you're looking at a loss being either eliminating you from bowl contention or being very close to doing so. I like Tennessee's chances quite a bit in this one. Ryan Helinski's been he's been actually pretty good running South Carolina's offense so far, and taking over after Jake Bentley was lost for the season. And South Carolina's offense has actually been slightly better than I thought it would be. That defense, though, has not been very good. It's not been. I didn't expect it to be fantastic. They did hold Kentucky to 7 points, but I didn't get to watch that game, Ben. Maybe you did, but to me, I wouldn't imagine that was I'm sure South Carolina's defense had something to do with it, but I'd imagine that's probably more on Kentucky's offense because Kentucky's offense hasn't been lighting the world on fire this season, especially after losing Terry Wilson for the year. But we'll get to the Kentucky game in a second, but looking at South Carolina, how winnable do you think that one is? Would you put it closer to Vandy, or would you put it closer to Missouri? Because I put it closer. It might be right smack dab in the middle, honestly, for me. But I do think that's a very winnable game, and one where Tennessee, depending on how the next couple weeks go, they could be favored, and it should be as a home game. You think they should be favored, but I think they could be favored by 3 to 5 points in that game potentially. On how the next 2 to 3 weeks go.
To me, it's right behind the Missouri game, and it's not a game that I really feel good about. If I had to rank the remaining SEC games outside of Bama and Georgia in terms of the games that I am most confident Tennessee can win, it would be Vanderbilt, then Kentucky, then Mississippi State, then South Carolina, then Missouri. So South Carolina is towards the bottom for me. Ryan Hilinski versus Tennessee secondary scares me. Statistically, Tennessee secondary looks good because BYU did not put up big numbers. UTC did not put up big passing numbers. And even Georgia State did not put up big passing numbers. But the Florida game was more indicative of how poorly Tennessee secondary has played through the beginning of the season, because even in the games in which their opponents weren't putting up big passing numbers, especially the UTC game, you go back and watch that game, Tennessee allowed multiple UTC receivers to beat them on simple slants. And either UTC's quarterback threw it 10 feet in the air above the receiver or in the ground, or the receiver dropped the pass. Their receivers were open. BYU's receivers were open. They just didn't make plays. And so Ryan Hilinski, yes, he's a freshman, but, he looked good this past Saturday, bouncing back from a disappointing performance against Missouri 2 weeks ago. He threw for over 300 yards against Alabama. I think he is another nightmare matchup on Tennessee's schedule that isn't favorable for the Vols. Now, he could come out and play like a freshman. It is absolutely possible, but I am a believer in Ryan Hilinski, and I think that he could really hurt Tennessee's secondary if given the chance. And the fact that Tennessee's pass rush is essentially non-existent from the defensive line. Now, Tennessee's linebackers did a fairly good job of generating a pass rush against Florida, but the defensive line was terrible. Aubrey Solomon and that gang have essentially done nothing all season long, and they cannot allow Ryan Hilinski to sit back and, just scan the field and have all day to throw the football. That's a recipe for disaster. And then on top of that, Tennessee's not very good at stopping the run either. Enrico Dowdle is a running back that is capable of really beating Tennessee and having a big day. So South Carolina's offense doesn't really give me reason for optimism in Tennessee's favor. And then defensively, they've kind of been up and down. I think their statistics are a little skewed because they went up against Tua Tagovailoa and that offense, and he just had a field day against South Carolina, which that Alabama offense is going to do that to everybody. So I think those numbers are a little skewed and may make South Carolina's defense look worse than it actually is. That front seven is filled with NFL talent. Will Muschamp has kind of struggled to get them all to play on the same page this year, and that's why going into this weekend against Kentucky, there was a lot of chatter about Will Muschamp's job and kind of fans upset with him. But then they come out and they hold Kentucky, albeit with Kentucky's backup quarterback and a grad transfer, and Sawyer Smith held them to 7 points. So I do think that defense is better than the statistics indicate, simply because that Alabama game kind of skewed things, and Tua Tagovailoa is just unstoppable. But again, they still have NFL defenders in the front seven. They have a very good secondary, and so I just quite frankly think from top to bottom, South Carolina is a better team and has more talent. The one thing I do like in Tennessee's favor for that game, though, is it is a home game. And Tennessee, South Carolina, it's always a close football game. That could be one of those games that I mentioned with Mississippi State where Brent Samaglia wins the game for Tennessee on a last-second kick. I'm telling you, there's going to be a game this year where Brent Samaglia wins it on his leg. The man is automatic, and It may be Mississippi State, it may be South Carolina, it may be Kentucky. Heck, it may even be Vanderbilt, maybe even Missouri on the road if Tennessee can force some turnovers and hang around. But there is going to be a game this year where Brent Maglia wins it for the Vols on a kick.
Dating back to 2012, I guess actually you could throw in 2011's game and maybe 2010, but they've all been close. You haven't had kind of a blowout victory per se in the South Carolina series since 2009, but dating back to 2012 especially, they've all been one-score games. They haven't been more than a one-touchdown difference. The biggest margin of victory for either team in that window of 2012 to last year's game was in 2017 when South Carolina won by 6, 15-9. Of course, that was an ugly, awful just game I wish I could forget that I ever saw. But every other game's been, I think every other game except for they've been 3 points or less. Every other game besides that one has been 3 points or less since 2012. So, I mean, like you said, it's always close. I anticipate this year's being close, and it could be similar to that 2017 game where it's going to be ugly or maybe not because like you said, you have Ryan Helinski and that kind of offense being able to throw the ball pretty well, and against the Tennessee secondary and a Tennessee pass rush that has been just flat out bad to start this season. It hasn't shown up maybe as much in the stat sheet like you said because they didn't, for whatever reason, BYU was kind of not being able to take advantage of it a whole lot until kind of late in the game, and then UTC, they dropped so many passes and had so much inaccurate throws that it didn't matter. Then you saw Florida pick Tennessee apart through the air with Kyle Trask at quarterback. Not one of the great Florida quarterbacks of old, but Kyle Trask, a guy who he played fine against Towson. That's against Towson. They should be able to kind of pulverize them into the ground. But anyway, looking at the last team I mentioned here, and then we'll kind of look ahead to the whole season and talk about what we think could happen with Tennessee. Kentucky, that's a team that has, you and I neither one thought Kentucky was going to have maybe as big of a drop-off this year as some people in the national media were expecting. But then they lose Terry Wilson for the season. And granted, he wasn't, he's not the second coming of Drew Lock or anything like that as far as a passer, but he was a very good offensive player, and he can run the ball really well. He gave Kentucky's offense, another dimension where you obviously got to protect with the pass because he can throw it a little bit, but that rushing attack that he brought, that ability he had to run the ball really would give guys like AJ Rose and I forget the other guy's name, their young running back who backs him up. It kind of opened things up for that Kentucky offense. Without him on the field, Sawyer Smith this year he's not been good. He was very turnover prone against Florida. I'm pulling the stats from the last game as I can't remember. I think he threw a couple picks against South Carolina as well. He threw one interception against South Carolina, one interception against Mississippi State. And Kentucky's offensive line, for as good as they are supposed to be, they've let up a lot of sacks, and that's obviously Terry Wilson was able to mask some of that because he could run and he could escape pressure. But Sawyer Smith got sacked 4 times against South Carolina. He got sacked 3 times against Mississippi State. He's completed less than 40% of his passes in the last 2 weeks. He was 15 of 41 against Mississippi State, and he was 11 of 32 against South Carolina. Then, to me, I think this is the most winnable game besides Vanderbilt, and honestly, maybe you can make the case, and I wouldn't, but you could maybe make the case that this is maybe more winnable than Vanderbilt because Tennessee has just had such an awful time with Vanderbilt over the last few years that maybe you could put in that, hey, maybe it's kind of mental for Tennessee a little bit with Vandy at this point, and they just, it's the last game of the season, so maybe you question what Tennessee's motives and stuff are. So maybe you can make an argument for Kentucky being more winnable. I wouldn't make that argument, but I would, I guess, maybe listen to it. Kentucky's not good. I mean, they just are flat out not good. They have AJ Rose at running back he's really good. Lynn Bowden's really good. But like you said earlier, with kind of Tennessee too, they have a really good supporting cast of skill players at receiver, tight end, and running back. And their offensive line's been okay. But that quarterback play has been, it's bad. And behind Sawyer Smith, they don't really have another option. Now that Terry Wilson's gone, they don't have, I'm about to pull up the roster here. I don't think they even have, to me, a capable backup behind Sawyer Smith. So to me, Ben, I think it's pretty easy. I think Kentucky, to me, is the next most winnable game on the schedule besides Vanderbilt. In SEC play, and like I said, I would listen to an argument if someone's saying, hey, maybe that they are actually more winnable than Vanderbilt. So I think Kentucky, I would at this point be a little surprised if Tennessee doesn't beat Kentucky. And that's obviously contingent on Tennessee getting, like I said, decent quarterback play. But I would be just a little bit surprised if Tennessee doesn't beat Kentucky with what I've seen from Kentucky to start this season.
Yeah, I definitely think the Kentucky game is winnable. Things have definitely changed for Kentucky based off preseason expectations with the loss of Terry Wilson, as you mentioned. And since the loss of Terry Wilson, that offense has just spiraled out of control. They looked pretty good against Florida, surprisingly, but then they have not looked good the past 2 weeks against Mississippi State and against South Carolina. Like I mentioned earlier, could only muster up 7 points against South Carolina, although I do believe that is a South Carolina defense that is better than the stats indicate. But they have to figure out something with Sawyer Smith. And, even he is banged up. But even before Sawyer Smith was banged up, he wasn't very effective. And now that he's banged up to go along with not being very effective, they have a terrible quarterback situation with he and Terry Wilson being injured. And they don't really have anybody other than that can get the ball to Lynn Bowden or obviously they do have a nice stable of backs, but they don't have anybody that can really lead them up and down the field. So if Tennessee's defense played like it did in the first half of Florida, like it did for 59 minutes against BYU, that is a game that I absolutely think Tennessee can win. Their defense has taken a step back, as it should, after you lose so much talent off of last year's defense. And even though it's on the road, that game isn't, an environment that rattles me, that just, scares me for Tennessee to walk into. And I think the common thing in all of these games outside of the Alabama and Georgia game is if Tennessee gets good quarterback play, Tennessee will win. If you told me today that, Jarrett Garantano plays the way he did against Auburn and South Carolina and Kentucky last year, if you told me he played like that the rest of the season, I would pick Tennessee to win the rest of its games except Alabama, Georgia, and Missouri. And if they were to win that, they'd finish the season with 5-6 wins? So it all comes down to quarterback play. Is Kentucky good enough to beat Tennessee? Yes, they are. Now that has more to do with Tennessee not being where Tennessee should be, but Kentucky can still beat Tennessee because the talent is fairly equal. It's just Kentucky is banged up right now, but there are pieces of Tennessee's team that can really cause problems for Kentucky, that being its receiver play, Marquez Callaway, Jawan Jennings. They are going to have a favorable matchup in pretty much every game outside of Alabama and Georgia the rest of the season. Can Tennessee receive good enough quarterback play to get those guys the football, to get those guys in the end zone? That's what it comes down to me. For the rest of the season, can Tennessee get adequate enough quarterback play to go out and win some of these football games? Because when you look at the opposing team on paper, they're not some team that just simply can't be beaten. They're not Alabama. They're not Georgia. They all have a lot of deficiencies, maybe except for Missouri. Missouri doesn't necessarily have a lot of deficiencies, although that is the same team that lost to Wyoming to start the season. So anything can happen in Missouri. But all those other teams, they all have glaring weaknesses. It's up to Tennessee to take advantage of those weaknesses, and it all starts with the quarterback play.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. So, putting all this together, obviously I think you and I and most Vol fans would have Tennessee losing to Georgia and Alabama. I think you and I, and like I said, most Vol fans would have Tennessee losing to Missouri. So that's 3 more losses. That's putting Tennessee with 6 losses and having a chance still, even after those 3 losses, of getting to a bowl game. What do you think Tennessee's? What do you think, just based off the top of your head right now, Tennessee's record in those other? I can't do math right now. And those other, I guess, 5 games will be against Mississippi State, Missouri, UAB, Vanderbilt, and Kentucky. I think I just mentioned. I mentioned South Carolina. So those other 5 games, assuming Tennessee loses to Georgia, Bama, and Missouri, what do you think Tennessee does in the other 5 games? Do you think that Tennessee somehow, goes 5-0 in those games, gets to 6-6 record in the bowl game? Do you think they go 4-1, 3-2? Because I look at games against UAB, Kentucky, and Vanderbilt. To me, I think at this point in time, assuming Tennessee doesn't have just absolute disastrous quarterback play, they haven't had disastrous quarterback play from Garantano. They haven't had good quarterback play. That's for sure. But it can absolutely get worse than what he's been. He's not been good, but he hasn't been one of the worst quarterbacks in the SEC. He hasn't been Sawyer Smith level, for example. He's not going out and completing 35% of his passes and not throwing touchdowns and throwing an interception or two. He didn't have a great game against Florida, but even that game he still completed over 50% of his passes, and he was a problem in that game, obviously, but Tennessee had other problems in that game too. So unless Tennessee has kind of a Sawyer Smith level of quarterback play from here on the rest of the season, I think Tennessee gets to it. And it sucks to say this because, boy, we thought heading into this season that Tennessee would be in a different spot than they are right now. But I think Tennessee has a pretty decent shot of getting to 4-8 because I think they can beat UAB, Vanderbilt, and Kentucky. But like I said, I will add that I don't think UAB is going to be as big of a pushover as a lot of people kind of thought heading into this season. But I think Tennessee gets those 3. And they could surprise, and I think, like I said, I think Tennessee has a good chance of beating South Carolina. I just would very, very much hesitate to say Tennessee will do anything better than 5-7. And I think if they get 5-7 with the way this year started, that would be a big positive for Tennessee and Jeremy Pruitt, something that you could sell to recruits to saying, hey, look at how bad we started, and then we finished the year 1-3 right now. We finished the year 4-4 and got 3 SEC wins, which was 1 more than they got last year. So I think if Tennessee does that, that's not where you wanted to be at the beginning of the season. It's still not where you want to be at the end of the season, but all things considered, that would be a lot better than what the alternative could be. I'm still going to side more towards 4-8, but really, Ben, like I said, as long as Tennessee can get even a little bit of an improvement from their quarterback play, I could see them going 5-7. But right now, I'm going to say 4-8.
I think they'll go 4-1 in those games that you mentioned. As of today, I am in the boat that with decent quarterback play, Tennessee is sitting 3-1 right now. And again, I don't even say good quarterback play. I think just decent, average quarterback play, above average. I think Tennessee is 3-1 right now. I think the Georgia State loss and the fact that Tennessee currently sits 1-3. It feels like just nothing has gone right for Tennessee. In a sense, that is absolutely true. But I think, I guess me saying that, what I'm trying to say is I think Tennessee is better than its 1-3 record indicates, in that, kind of how like Josh Dobbs' play, covered up a lot of deficiencies on the offensive side of the ball when he was here. I think Tennessee's poor quarterback play has done the reverse. I think Jarrett Garantano's play has covered up the efficiency of the offense and defense at times, and I don't think they're as bad as the Georgia State game appeared. I think that game was a fluke. I think if Tennessee played that game 10 more times, I think they would probably win. No, I don't even say probably. I think that they would win 10 out of 10 times. That game simply came down to overlooking them, not preparing for them in practice, and not playing hard. Jeremy Pruitt would not make that same mistake again, and I think Tennessee would win that game 10 out of 10 times. Georgia State is a slightly better version of UTC, and if they played that game over 10 times, I think Tennessee would win every single time. I truly believe that. So I think the Georgia State game was a fluke. Alante Taylor had his gaffe at the end of the BYU game, but it never should have been in that situation. The coaching staff feels as if 4 or 5 touchdowns were left on the field in that BYU game. I went back and I kind of counted up, and Tennessee should have won like 38-13. That game should have been well out of reach before Alante Taylor ever had the opportunity to have that mishap at the end of the game. But because Jarrett Garantano played poorly, that did not happen. So that should have been a win. Obviously UTC, and then I'm not willing to say that Tennessee would have beat Florida, but with good quarterback play in the second quarter against the Gators, starting the second quarter with a delay of game, missing Dominic Wood-Anderson wide open, and then the interception on the miscommunication with Marquez Callaway. What if that pass to Dominic Wood-Anderson doesn't just completely miss? What if JG hits that throw and he scores on that play? He being Dominic Wood-Anderson, it's a tie game. Or Tennessee's down 10-7, it's a completely different ball game. So my point in bringing that up is that I think with decent quarterback play in the Swamp, Tennessee at least has a chance to win that football game late. Florida wasn't going to blow out Tennessee unless they got poor quarterback play. So I do think Tennessee finishes 4-1 as of today, and I know that sounds crazy, but it has more to do with me not seeing enough from Mississippi State, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, and UAB. I think South Carolina and Missouri are losses to go along with Georgia and Alabama, but again, I don't see enough from Mississippi State, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, and UAB as of today to make me think that they're significantly better teams than Tennessee. If anything, I actually kind of think Tennessee is a better team, but poor quarterback play is kind of masking that. And so that is kind of why I believe Tennessee will finish 4-1. And although I don't think Tennessee wins the South Carolina game, wins the Missouri game, they are more than capable of doing so, especially if the JG that played against Auburn, South Carolina, and Kentucky last year shows up in those football games.
I think it's well said. I'm just going to side, like I said, a little more negatively because I've seen Tennessee football so often. I know you have too, Ben, that it's hard for me to get too super positive about, especially this year's team. But we'll see how we're feeling after the game on Saturday. I'll at least do some kind of post game reaction show, and you and I will do something. Maybe the next day on Sunday, Ben. I think that was pretty successful. The last time we did kind of the Sunday podcast after the Florida game, to kind of a day to absorb everything and take it in and then talk about it. And that was obviously a lot about the quarterback battle stuff. And I assume we'll probably see both quarterbacks this weekend. You and I will talk about that in different pieces this week. I'm sure we'll talk about it in the next podcast. But we'll see how positive we're feeling about Tennessee's chances of finishing the season strong after Saturday. But that'll do it for this podcast. We'll talk about Georgia a little bit more in the next episode and talk about, Georgia all week. We'll have previews and stuff about the Bulldogs and matchups for Tennessee and different stuff like that. We'll also kind of take a little bit of a look at other things. And basketball and baseball both. Ben, you did a piece about Tennessee baseball going and sweeping Clemson in their fall scrimmage over the weekend. So we've had a few different things about basketball up. I'll have some interviews transcribed that I've been meaning to do for a long time about some of Tennessee's incoming players for this season in men's basketball. You had an interview, Ben, last week. We put it on our podcast of you speaking with Lady Vol head coach Kelly Harper. So if you haven't listened to that and you want to check it out, definitely go do that. It's on our podcast on our website and on Apple Podcast and Android too, but also on our YouTube channel. You can watch it that way and listen to it that way as well. So we'll be back again a little bit later this week. I'll get my words right in a second. We'll be back a little later this week with another episode of the podcast. We'll have plenty of other stuff for you as well. And until next time, this has been another episode of the RTI Podcast.